All right. Hello, everybody out there in the tubes of the internet, and welcome to This Week in Space. Woo! My name is John Emerson Bell. I'm an astrologer and licensed mental health counselor, tarot reader, and I like to show up every Monday at 11-ish a.m. Mountain Time and give you all the straight dope about what's going on in space. And so this week we got a very special program for all y'all, kind of a Chiron special because we have Chiron entering into the fixed sign of Taurus. So usually I go through all of the transits of the week, but this week I got inspired and just started cranking on the story of Chiron and all the little cul-de-sacs that come off of it. And that's what we're just going to be talking about today. So yeah, I won't be sharing too many charts for those of y'all on YouTube. So you're just going to have to deal with looking at my mug and my chaotic background. And yeah, you can just kind of zone out and listen to a story and some of my meandering thoughts on the archetype of Chiron, who is the teacher and a wounded healer. And yeah, one of my favorite planetoids out there. Um, Before we jump into the tale of Chiron, just a couple announcements. I think I'm going to be co-facilitating the 2027 Oracle Dream Retreat in May of 2027 with Sarah Janes. Also, I believe Ariel Gutman's going to be there, Dave Lunds, a bunch of other really brilliant people. It's going to be a 10-day oracular dreaming odyssey in Greece, going to a bunch of sacred sites, including Delphi, which was a temple to Apollo, who we're going to talk about a bunch during this program. If you are interested or curious, you can reach out to Sarah Janes, who is running the show. The email is themysteries.org. You can also follow her on Instagram at Sarah Jane's Dreaming. And yeah, or you can hit me up, DM me, email me, whatever, and we'll get you some info. But we're taking deposits for that right now, and I think it's filling up quick. So if you've ever been interested in going to Greece, talking about astrology, dreaming, mythology, all that great stuff, I recommend reaching out, hitting up either me or Sarah Janes, and hope to see you there. Also, I do a weekly, well, sometimes weekly radio show called the Melee Report, which is very much like this, except for with a lot of music in it to sort of illustrate the transits. And that's called the Melee Report. And it's like this, but more rock, less talk. And then the last announcement, if you are interested in any of the stuff that I talk about with during the long and tragic tale of Chiron. I am available for Chiron chart readings. I'm booking into July, so if you're interested in checking out your natal placement with Chiron, or if you have Chiron in Taurus and you're coming up on your Chiron return, hit me up. You can find me on Instagram at Blind Stallion Space Wizard, and you can DM me there or go to my website, campwizardcamp.com, and contact me that way. All right, so without further ado, my friends, let's get into the long and tragic tale of Chiron. And I guess before we do, I just want to let folks know about the transits that are happening this week that I'm not going to be talking about, but maybe you want to know. So on Monday, June the 15th, we have Venus in Leo, sextile Uranus in Gemini at 2 degrees 54 minutes. On Tuesday, the 16th, we have Venus in Leo, trine Neptune in Aries. That's going down at 4 degrees and 18 minutes. On Wednesday, the 17th, we have Venus in Leo, trine or oppose Pluto retrograde in Aquarius at 5 degrees and 7 minutes. And then on Friday, the 19th, we have Chiron entering Taurus for the first time. And we're going to be talking all about that today. And then on Sunday, the 21st, we have the sun moving into cardinal Cancer. That's happening at 1:24 a.m. Pacific time, making that 3:24 4:24, excuse me, a.m. on the East Coast, and that marks the summer solstice, which is always an exciting time. The supremacy of the light, the longest day, and then right after that, about an hour later, the sun in Cancer will sextile Chiron in Taurus. So those are the things that are going down this week. But like I said in the intro, I decided to talk all about Chiron because I don't know, I have a deep love for the Centaur and Wounded Healer. So Friday, June the 19th, Chiron enters the fixed Earth sign of Taurus, which is ruled by Venus. So, Chiron is a planetoid or an asteroid. The designation keeps changing. And it has a elliptical orbit, which brings it between the orbits of Saturn and Uranus. And this is important, and we'll come back to this again, but it's sort of the link or the bridge between Saturnian themes of responsibility, old forms, limitations, and Uranian innovation and the desire to renegotiate old forms and create something entirely new, and the striving for freedom. And Chiron sort of works as an intermediary between them. And this is one of the roles of Chiron is to be on the threshold. And we'll talk about this more as this story progresses. But because Chiron has this elliptical orbit, they spend an uneven amount of time in each sign. Chiron spends about 8 or 9 years in Aries and between 6 and 7 years in Taurus. And Chiron first entered Aries on April the 17th of 2018, and then did a little back and forth between Aries and Pisces until February the 18th of 2019. And they have been in the cardinal sign of Aries ever since. And so Chiron enters Taurus for their first experience of fixed Earth since the late 70s, early 80s. And this is happening on Friday. And in fact, Chiron was discovered at 3 degrees and 49 minutes of Taurus on October the 18th of 1977. So Chiron is coming up to their own Chiron return, which I think is pretty exciting. And so, um, anyway, Chiron was in Taurus from 1977 to 1983. So, folks who were born during that time period are coming up on your Chiron return. And also that sort of that period between 1977 and 83, um, I believe encompasses the what is called the Oregon Trail generation, which is this small slice between, the end of the 70s and the very beginning of the 80s. That's like a micro generation. And it's kind of characterized by people who were born into an analog world and then immigrated to a digital landscape. And so, those of us who were born in that time period, excuse me, those of us who were born during that time period kind of grew up without cell phones. We had pay phones, we had pagers, we had third spaces. If you wanted to hang out with somebody, you just went to a place and like waited for people to show up. So you had like, people of that generation growing up hanging out at the gas station or like the corner store, waiting for people to show up. There was no texting, there was no cell phones. If you were running late, you couldn't be like, yo, I'm running late, hold up. Where are you guys at? You just had to go someplace and figure it out. And then as this generation grew up, they moved into, the era of cell phones and email and, all of this digital connectivity. And I think that there is some healing that the Oregon Trail generation during this Chiron return can bring, having this memory of the way things were before the interconnectivity of everything. And perhaps there's some wisdom in that that can be returned to the world, which might be important during these times. So Chiron will be in fixed Taurus from now or from Friday until September the 17th. And then it will dip back into Aries until April the 14th of 2027. And then Chiron will be staying in fixed Taurus until 2033, 2034, when it does a back and forth dance into Gemini. So that's kind of the lay of the land and the timeline. And now let's go into the long and tragic tale of the centaur Chiron. So, Chiron is the child of Kronos, Saturn, and the nymph Philyra. Kronos receives a prophecy that one day one of his children would overthrow him. So he does what any logical person would do and starts eating his children as soon as they're born. And his wife Rhea is not so into it. And after he eats the first five children, she decides, okay, no more of this. And she hides the sixth child, Zeus, away and gives Kronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothing to eat. And in his baby devouring frenzy, Kronos doesn't even know the difference between a newborn baby and a stone wrapped in cloth. But so he devours the stone, and Rhea spirits Zeus away to go be raised by the goat nymph Amalthea. And Kronos kind of realizes that instead of eating a baby, he ate a rock and spends his days wandering the countryside looking for Zeus so he can devour him once and for all. So uh, on one of his hungry baby hunting excursions, he spies the nymph Philyra, and he is immediately taken by her beauty. So he starts spitting some game, and like one thing leads to another, and they start getting it on and knocking some boots. However, around the same time, Rhea is wondering where her husband is and why it took him so long to look for Zeus. And so she goes out looking for Kronos. And she arrives on the scene just as Kronos and Philyra are reaching their climax. And Kronos looks up in a moment of ecstasy and sees Rhea, his wife, coming up over the hill and hears her calling his name. And he decides in this moment that the best course of action is to turn himself into a stallion and run away so he doesn't get caught cheating on his sister wife. Soon after this event, Philyra gives birth to a baby with the head, arms, and torso of a human being and the body and legs of a horse because I think Kronos finished when he was in horse form. And she's freaked out and feeling full of shame that she has given birth to such a monster and refuses to have any part of this. So she prays to the gods to turn her into a linden tree. And the gods are like, cool, you got it. Bada bing, bada boom, she's a tree. And Chiron is left sitting at the foot of this tree. And thus Chiron receives his first wound, the wound of abandonment and rejection, which he carries with him throughout his life. And this is one of the experiences of Chiron. The wound is usually unfair and oftentimes not our fault. It might come through accident, ancestry, or early childhood development, or a mother wanting to turn herself into a tree and a father who turned himself into a stallion and ran away. It takes all kinds. And while the wound is not our fault, it becomes our responsibility to heal it. And this is the sort of Saturn or Kronos parentage of Chiron. The responsibility required in our healing process and our willingness to take responsibility for our own care and healing. And I'd just like to add in another footnote here. The tragic, uh, the tragic tale of Chiron begins because of a prophecy. Saturn, Kronos, is trying to escape his fate. And so to do this, he eats his children, which I don't know. And when one escapes, Zeus, Kronos goes to track it down to avoid the prophecy that he will be overthrown by his children. And madcap hilarity ensues. So there's this quality of Chiron which deals with fate and prophecy as well as inheritance. Kronos tries to escape the fate of being overthrown by his children, the way he overthrew his father, Ouranos, by kind of replicating the violence done to him and his siblings by Ouranos, who continually pushed his children into Gaia, the earth, who is his partner. And so Kronos eats his babies. Another like suppressing the kind of creativity and the emergence of things. And the attempt to escape our fate can often end up replicating patterns of inherited trauma and violence. So both Ornos and Kronos, Saturn, try to repress their children or push away what is uncomfortable and threatening. When energy is suppressed, it builds in power and seeks release and integration, which usually causes flare-ups, fractures, fragmentation, disruptions, and explosions as ways that this trauma or the ways that this energy is seeking to be acknowledged and integrated. And so part of the Chiron work is to recognize the places of imbalance and to bring the system back into harmony. In the case of inherited wounding or intergenerational trauma, which are, things that we receive, which are not our fault, which we never asked for, and which are objectively unfair, Chiron helps to recognize the ancestral patterns and to shift responses so that the patterns are not repeated through the rejection or avoidance of fate. Chiron helps us to incorporate the circumstances of our inheritance and to work with them in new and creative ways in order to create new pathways and facilitate healing, which can occur on individual, ancestral, and cultural levels. So, returning to the sad tale of Chiron. When last we left Chiron, poor little baby Chiron is sitting alone at the foot of his tree mother, Philyra. He never knew his dad, and his mom would rather be a tree than be his mother, and so he's feeling pretty sad. So the little baby centaur is sitting by his mom tree, and he is found by Apollo and Artemis, who are out strolling around. Apollo and Artemis are the embodiment of sunlight and moonlight. And they find Chiron and they're like, oh, look at this cool little thing. Let's take it home. And they raise him as their own. So Chiron is born of the physical world. Of He is the son of Saturn. He is born of limitation and physicality, but he is raised by light, the ephemeral world of potential and possibilities, and the aspiration. This is also encoded in the symbol of the centaur, half human, half horse. The uh, the gross animal body of the horse, with all of its power, somatic wisdom, intuition, and bestial urges, being temporal and earthbound. It's the mortal body, and constrained by lifespan and Saturnian 3D reality. And then there's the human half, which holds the rational and logical thought, but also gives rise to the imaginal, which is one of the most powerful things that humans have, as well as the aspirational part of us that feels connected to and longs for the divine. And it's this split between the human and divine parts of ourselves, between our Saturn-bound mortality and our longing for divinity, which is one of the core wounds that I think all human beings carry. So, anyway, Apollo, god of sunlight, god of prophecy, music, poetry, healing, and harmony, and his twin sister, Artemis, virginal goddess of the hunt, wild animals, wild things, the power of fertility, initiation, and midwifery. From Apollo and Artemis, Chiron learned how to talk to the plant world and learn the names and uses of the plants, learned archery and other survival skills, as well as music, poetry, midwifery, healing, and prophecy, which he in turn taught to others. And a few of these skills stand out to me. So, prophecy, we already talked about, but I like to imagine a prophecy in every family line that one day someone will come along and heal the curse that family holds. And the Chiron placement reveals our ability to heal that aspect of our lineage and to be the one that our ancestors have been waiting for to fulfill the prophecy of healing instead of repeating ancient patterns laid down by ancestral wounding. Harmony is another gift that Chiron receives from Apollo. Apollo being the god of music, harmony is really important. And harmony is also a key component of healing, which is another one of Apollo's attributes. Harmony and health are kind of synonymous. When something is out of balance, we become sick. Healing, wholeness, and health is about bringing systems back into balance and harmony. Chiron shows us where things are imbalanced, as well as helping us to know the remedy the system needs to bring it back into a more harmonious state. Another gift that I'd like to touch on is the art of midwifery, which comes from Artemis. Chiron's role in astrology is to act as a midwife to help deliver us from the spaces of the wound into a process of healing. Chiron's orbit lies between Saturn and Uranus, and they help to carry us from the world of limitation, or Saturn, into the world of possibility, or Uranus, from old patterns into new systems. Chiron takes the conditions and limitations that Saturn offers us and reconstitutes them into a new story, a new innovative system that creates something new and more in line with the idealized vision that Uranus offers us. And oftentimes, in doing this, it provides a lot more freedom in a life. Chiron also holds that threshold space between the human and the animal, the physical and the imaginal. They help us through the threshold of change, from suffering into wholeness. And from Artemis, Chiron also learned how to communicate with the world of plants and animals. And this brings us to a key theme of Chiron and Taurus, healing the wound of our separation from nature. Being half human and half horse, Chiron is intricately linked to the natural world. However, he receives his second wound in the horse half of his body, which we'll get to later. But this speaks to one of the core wounds we all carry, the feeling of being separate from nature, which has given rise to fear, dismissal, and rejection of the natural world, resulting in the predominant view of nature as a threat that needs to be overcome, dominated, and tamed. And the gifts that nature provides, as instead of things that need to be dealt with in reciprocity, are resources to be extracted. And because of this, as Chiron returns to Taurus, we are all carrying a wound of climate catastrophe, not the same type of fear of nature, but fear of the future, and a deep embodied grief of the degradation and harm that we have inflicted on the natural world. And like most Chiron wounds, it feels deeply unfair. As individuals, we can feel like it isn't our fault, yet we are made complicit in this harm through the societies, economies, and global systems we are embedded in. Francis Weller, we'll pull this out. Francis Weller, who I've referenced on this show before, speaks about this wound as the third gate of sorrow in his book on grief, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which one of my favorites. This thing is actually like totally falling apart. All of the pages are falling out because I've read it so much. It's an excellent book on grief and sorrow. And one of the things that he talks about is the collective sorrow that we all hold for the natural world. And so I'm going to read some quotes from him. He says, "The third gate of sorrow, the sorrows of the world. The third gate of grief opens when we register the losses of the world around us, whether or not we consciously recognize it. The daily diminishment of species, habitats, and cultures is noted in our psyches. Much of the grief we carry is not personal, but shared, communal. And this sense of collective grief for the condition of the world is part of the Chiron wound, which we have an opportunity to witness, acknowledge, and work to heal over the time that Chiron moves through Taurus. Weller quotes psychologist uh, Shalise Glendinning, Shalise Glendinning, who said, to open our hearts to the sad history of humanity and the devastated state of the earth is the next step in our reclamation of our bodies, the body of our human community, and the body of the earth. And perhaps this is the first act of Chiron and Taurus, the acknowledgement of grief and the practice of compassion for ourselves, for each other, and for the world we live in. When Chiron's wound gets activated, it can feel overwhelming and we can want to isolate, hide, and wallow. However, when this happens, it is important to remember we can also take opposite action, come into connection and come into community and increase our capacity to be present. Instead of tapping out, we can tap in, and that can look a lot of different ways. Weller goes on to say, what if we are not separate from the world at all? It is our spiritual responsibility to acknowledge these losses. What if this is the uh, animus mundi, the soul of the world, weeping through us? And I love this idea because what if the grief we feel is actually a call to be of service to this world that we are not separate from? The separation from this world is cognitive distortion. It's a delusion. And so, what if the acknowledgement of the grief that we are holding and our ability to express it and let it move through us has a healing effect, not only on ourselves, but our location and the in places that we are embedded in and our communities that we are a part of? Instead of that grief being rejected and ignored so that it continues to fester under the surface and drags us deeper into a collective sickness, what if the harmony we need right now is the sound of wailing to help bring us back into harmony with the world? Weller continues, our inheritance includes intimate and permeable exchange with the wild world. I fucking love that. It is what our minds and bodies expect. We are embedded in this matrix of life, and we knew the world and ourselves only through this perception. It was unmediated intimacy with the living world, with no trace of separation between the human and the more than human world. And so when I think of the centaur, that half human, half horse, I think of the interconnected intimacy with life, with nature, with our surroundings. And the wound of duality and perceived separation that creates a sense of otherness, disrupts that intimacy with the wild world. Is a perception of ourselves as other or separate from the natural world. And the idea that nature is something other, inanimate, something that can be mastered, dominated, and extracted from for our own benefit. And this is the danger of otherness. It creates a story of objectification and dehumanization. And another component of this is that Taurus, as a fixed sign, is interested in stability and maintaining our stability and comfort. And in our current conditions, many of the things that bring comfort and a sense of stability are also what are destroying the planet and harming other humans. With Chiron and Taurus, we're going to need to reckon with this tension between the comfort that we have become accustomed to and the impact that that has on our world. Continuing on with Weller's writing from The Wild Edge of Sorrow, he says, what was once a seamless embrace has now become a breach, a tear in our sense of belonging. Glendinning calls this our original trauma. This trauma carries with it all the recognizable symptoms associated with psychic injury: chronic anxiety, disassociation, distrust, hypervigilance, disconnection, and many others. We are left with a profound loneliness and isolation that we rarely acknowledge. It is as if we have completely normalized our condition. And yet, this feeling of separation profoundly affects the range of our reach, the ways that we participate in the landscape, and sense of our allegiance with the living world. Our soul life flickers dimly, and rather than feeling a kinship with the entire breathing world, we inhabit and defend a small shell of the world, occupying our daily life with what linguist David Hinton calls the reckless industry of self. This beautiful and strange otherness was also meant to be seen in one another's eyes. We too were meant to embody a vivid, animate life, to live close to our wild souls, our wild bodies and minds. We were meant to dance, sing, play, and laugh, unself-consciously, tell stories, make love, and take delight in the brief but privileged adventure of incarnation. The wild within and the wild without are kin, the one enlivening the other in a beautiful tango. Ooh, that hits. I don't know how that felt for y'all, but that hits. And I can kind of like feel that Chiron wound of separation and the loss of that, interconnection and intimacy with the world, kind of stirring in me. And I think part of the work of Chiron and Taurus is to reclaim this wild soul and our ability to take delight in this brief but privileged adventure of incarnation. And the work is about repairing our separation and remembering our connection and embedded relationship with this living, pulsing, breathing, animate world. Through remembering our connection with the natural and more than human world, which is part of our birthright, helps us to um, it helps to bring us out of the frozen, fragmented state of trauma and allows a space for connection that can help us to heal the wound of sorrow for the world so that we are more capable of showing up and doing our part to support each other and to heal our relationship with the natural world. But I digress. Let me get back to our tale. So, Chiron, being raised by Artemis and Apollo, learns about all of their neat stuff and becomes a wise teacher. And this is one of his roles as a way that he is able to kind of soothe his core wound of abandonment. In sharing knowledge, Chiron is of service and gains acceptance and respect, which helps him with that core wound of rejection. Chiron becomes the mentor of everyone who is anyone in the ancient world. And he becomes the teacher of heroes, which is a way that I really like to think about Chiron. Kind of gets him out of that sad pigeonhole of the wounded healer. And I think that there's something more kind of aspirational and glorious about the role as the teacher of heroes. And I think mentorship is a really important Chiron theme. Chiron becomes the teacher of Jason, Hercules, who will become important later in the story, Achilles, as well as the god Asclepius, who is also the son of Apollo and the god of healing. And so Chiron's role of mentor and teacher helps him to heal that wound of rejection through developing a sense of purpose and self-worth. And I think and I think the wound of self-worth is another theme that will emerge during Chiron's time in Taurus. Taurus, which is a Venus ruled sign, deals with issues of value and worth. What do we value and how do we value ourselves? The wound of self-worth can run deep into our programming. And Taurus kind of wants to hold on to what is stabilizing. And one of the things with pain and discomfort and wounding is we create a story around it to protect and stabilize it. And we may want to hold on to that story because even though it sucks, we've gotten really comfortable in the discomfort of it. So stories like I'm useless, I'm unlovable, I can't do any better can keep us locked in this sort of victim role. And they operate to protect those deeper wounds, those core wounds. So in Taurus, Chiron is helping us to look at these fixed stories and to explore the core wound or belief that these stories have grown up around like scar tissue to protect. And the question with Chiron and Taurus is the discomfort that I'm living with preferable to the possible discomfort that I might experience if I change? And what comfort or joy might be on the other side of that change? Taurus is about knowing what we want and don't want in life and having more of what we want, more pleasure and more joy. With Chiron here, the way to get there is through working through the wound of self-worth that keeps us locked in old, outdated stories, that keeps us separated and small. And I think part of this as well is learning to let go. As fixed Earth, Taurus wants to hold on and be like, nah, I'm good here. And they hold on stubbornly. And part of this healing work is learning to let go of the poisons that we're holding on to, the old stories, the old programming that we perceive keeps us safe, but is actually keeping us small and in kind of a constant low level state of discomfort. And, the act of letting go is not necessarily fun, but it might allow us to have a bigger life on the other side where we can actually love ourselves. Just saying. And for Chiron, he found this sense of self-worth through sharing his wisdom with others and acting as a mentor to the youths. So now Chiron, teacher, mentor, things are going great. He is living life, teaching heroes, having fun, totally living his best life. Until one day, one of Chiron's students, Hercules, who is in between his labors, decides to take a detour into Centaur country to have dinner with one of his buddies, the wise centaur Pholeus. Hercules and Pholeus are having a great time, spirited conversation, eating dinner, swapping stories of heroic deeds. And then Hercules, who had a few in him and is kind of really feeling himself, is like, "Hey, you know what, Pholeus? We should totally open that bottle of forbidden insanity wine. I bet it would go great with this here fish." And Folius is like, "Nah, bro, we don't do that here because it makes all the other centaurs lose their shit and it's a total disaster. It's really not a good idea." But they knock back a few more drinks, and Hercules keeps on peer pressuring Folius to open the wine. And probably because Folius was a little tipsy himself, or maybe just to get Hercules to shut the fuck up, he pops the top on the insanity wine. And all of the centaurs that are hanging out around the cave, eavesdropping on the conversation, freak the fuck out and start running amok. And so let's pause here for a moment because Chiron was different from most of the other centaurs. The centaurs in ancient Greece were a menace. They were like a roving band of frat boys that would just show up at your party or crash your wedding and drink all the booze, eat all the food, break all the furniture, and copulate with anything or anyone they could find. They were like kind of an alcoholic tornado of constant party vibes, leaving a trail of wreckage and heartbreak in their wake. And Chiron is different from the other centaurs, and they wouldn't let him play in any of their centaur games because he's a child of Saturn. And with Saturn as a part of his lineage, Chiron understands things like limits and boundaries and responsibilities, which are total buzzkills for the rest of the centaur gang. And this may also be a part of the Chiron wound. The outsider or reject who finds their people and then feels othered or rejected from the rejects. And being rejected from the rejects, like, feels pretty bad, really hurts. And it can give us the story that we don't belong anywhere. But Chiron's connection with Saturn, Kronos, gives him the ability to cultivate skills that the other centaurs just weren't interested in. Things like learning and music and, mentorship. What they were interested in right now, the other centaurs, was setting couches on fire and smashing up Folius's house and getting their hands on that insanity wine. And this is an important component of the myth, the insanity wine, the collective freakout, the chaos and frenzy that we get caught up in, the triggering of the collective fear or hurt that causes people to lose their minds. And we're seeing this unfold in Northern Ireland right now, right after a Sudanese man was charged with attempted murder and a knife attack. And following that, the insanity wine of social media was opened with videos of the attack and calls for protests and violence. And then 3 nights of violent protests followed. And the BBC reported homes and vehicles were set on fire, water cannons deployed, more than a dozen police officers injured, and an atmosphere of fear has descended with reports of people having been threatened for having a different skin color and families being put out of their homes because they're black. This is a horrific example of how the insanity wine of the Chiron myth functions in contemporary culture. Wounds of fear, scarcity, racism, otherness become activated and inflamed by the rage machine of social media echo chambers and erupt into violence and chaos. People lose their senses, become hijacked by the collective shadow, and regress to the sort of more bestial parts of the centaur, violently acting out from a place of fear, like an animal when it's trapped or wounded. So, returning to our story, Hercules, hero that he is, leaps up and grabs his smashing club and starts cracking centaur heads. And him and Folius are battling back this riot of thirsty wine-crazed centaurs. And Hercules pulls out his bow and starts firing off rounds and dropping centaurs left and right. And now Chiron hears the commotion going on from his own cave and comes running out to try and mediate the situation between his student, Hercules, and his centaur people, seeking to bridge the gap between these two worlds. And these two worlds are in kind of extremes at this moment. Hercules, as the hero, is like the overemphasized ego function, operating as the kind of relentless industry of self. The individual striving against all odds without care for how their actions impact their surroundings. And on the other side, the centaurs are in their animal frenzy. And these are two really dangerous extremes, the like extreme ego of the human and the bestial frenzy of the horse half. And these two extremes at war with each other, and Chiron is trying to put himself in the middle to try and repair this rift. And he pays the price in a perfect example of how no deed ever goes unpunished. Chiron gets winged by one of Hercules' stray arrows and receives his second incurable wound. This is an important moment in the story because it reminds us that not all times are the right time to reconcile the warring factions of ourselves or the world. Timing is important. And if we're really activated or feeling fragmented, it's probably not an opportune time to rush in and do the deep healing work. We want to do that work when we have the Taurus qualities of stability and resource. That being said, part of the way that I found Chiron work, part of the way that I found Chiron to work is that the experience of activation allows us an inroad into the wound so that we can support it and work with it. And when we're able to tap into that pain and then return to a place of stability and resource, it increases our capacity to be with the wound and our ability to do the work required to heal it. But you don't want to do that in the middle of a riot with poison tipped arrows flying every which way. And like the Buddha said, why do you want to go around bothering people? And what he meant by that is we don't need to be getting up in other people's business trying to fix or heal them. Sometimes you can just let it be, let things simmer down, and do the healing work after the eruption occurs, and do the repair after the eruption, not in the middle of a riot. But our buddy Chiron got all caught up in it, and he got hit with an arrow that was dipped in the hydra poison, which is really bad news because hydra poison is fatal. However, Chiron is immortal, so he can't die. So he's kind of stuck. Puts him in what we like to call in the business a double bind, which is a situation where no matter what you do, you're fucked. And the poison creates a wound that cannot heal. But he cannot die, so he has to keep living with this wound. So Chiron catches this arrow in his thigh, which is in the horse half of his body. Speaking again to the animal parts of ourselves being wounded, which we can consider again our connection to the earth and to place and our ability to be grounded and present. And these themes will come to the surface again during Chiron's time in Taurus, as qualities of presence and feeling grounded are components of the Taurus sign of fixed earth. And so I want to just take a moment to talk about the Hydra and its poison blood. So please join me on this other cul-de-sac of thought. So one of Hercules' trials was to defeat the Lernaean Hydra, which is a many-headed monster with poison breath and poison blood. Every time Hercules cut off one of its heads, two would grow back in its place, which made it pretty impossible to kill. And this makes me think of intrusive thoughts or painful feelings or our shadow material, which are the parts of ourselves that we dislike or reject. And when we try and cut off or repress these parts, they return with a vengeance and oftentimes multiply. So when Hercules finally defeats the Hydra by cutting off each head in turn and cauterizing its bloody neck stump, Hercules decides to dip his arrows in the poison blood of the Hydra, which is kind of interesting to consider. The using the resource of the monsters that we confront and the monsters and fears and shadow parts that we are able to confront and best and overcome often become resources that we can use later on. However, one of these poison-tipped arrows hits Chiron in the horse thigh, and he's not having a good time with that. And Melanie Reinhart talks about the Hydra poison in Chiron, the Healing Journey, right here, which is an excellent resource on Chiron for those who are interested. And Melanie Reinhart is the astrologer who I believe has done some of the most work on Chiron and has a couple great books on the subject. Anywho, she says about Chiron. His wound therefore represents the return of what has been repressed and the suffering we feel in meeting the poison of the hydra within ourselves. So here is a reminder of the Buddhist notion of the three poisons: craving, aversion, ignorance. We may need to humbly pay attention to whatever the hydra represents, giving it space through wise awareness. Only then can its destructive powers transform. And so um, I love that she brought in the three poisons, which I talked about last week. And, as that hydra poison pumps through the blood, we can go into ignorance or delusion of I am separate, I am alone. We start telling stories about what's happening, how unfair it is, and this increases our suffering. And or we go into aversion, which is I hate this, right? Rejection, again, deepening that suffering. Or we go into craving, which is, oh, I need something else to take this away. Drugs or sex or gambling or the phone or whatever, you name it. There are all these cravings that we can reach for to try and settle the activation of that hydra poison in our system. And, what Melanie Reinhardt is talking about and the Buddha before her is that being an awareness of what is actually happening. Can I be that? Can I be with this? Can I stay present in this moment? What do I need to support myself instead of rejecting or going into story or reaching for something that we think is going to alleviate it? So after the battle is done, Hercules is like, "Ooh, so sorry, my dude. My bad. Well, I gotta run. I got another labor to take care of. Good luck with that leg. You might want to get that checked out. It's looking pretty gnarly, dude." And then Hercules pieces out and goes about his labors. And Chiron sulks back to his cave to nurse his festering wound. And it's important to look at the way the heroic operates in this tale because it's sort of a through line, a subtext. The hero is often seen as being solar, and Chiron is the foster child of Apollo, who is a solar god and has heroic qualities. He is also the teacher of heroes, and yet he is wounded by one of his students, Hercules, who is the archetypal hero. And one of the functions of Chiron and Ares was healing of the heroic, dealing with the wounds of courage and assertiveness, and also to help heal our collective idea of the hero, which has become kind of twisted and separated from its origins. In ancient Greek, the hero cult was chthonic. It's an underworld cult. The dead heroes were praised and honored, and they functioned as kind of intermediaries between the land of the living and the underworld. The hero was a demigod, half human, half god, and they functioned like an underworld reflection of the gods, which probably evolved out of older forms of ancestor worship. And their burial mounds and tombs became places of worship and a point of recognition of the underworld and the relatedness between the Olympian realm, the underworld, and our terrestrial world. And as well as the tension between immortality and mortality. However, now we have lost that balance and forgotten the underworld aspect of the heroic. In Dream in the Underworld, James Hillman, who I love, writes, our civilization, with its heroic monuments, tributes to victory over death, ennobles the Herculean ego who does not know how to behave in the underworld. So the hero in a living world of gods and the heroic today are two very different cases. Although the second arises from the first, he was half man, half god. But when the gods are dead, the hero becomes all too human. The divine portion is assumed wholly by the human, and we are left with the foundling figure of humanism and its worship of man. And that was Hellman again. So without the context of a ensouled world, the hero has become kind of hijacked by the ego, which is driven by its own quest for immortality. And again, this theme of the reckless industry of self. Hillman goes on to say, cut off from this psychic background, the heroic becomes psychopathic, an exaltation of activity for its own sake. The locus of its cult is not the burial mound on which the city and its deeds are founded, but in the human body itself, in the humanistic ego. And Melanie Reinhardt writes, the image of the hero gradually became literalized into an idealized way of being in the world, a Superman attempt to avoid insignificance and oblivion. The human ego appropriated the archetype, often with tragic consequences, as graphically illustrated by our contemporary worship of celebrity. And the emphasis on celebrity, on billionaires, and the myth of the self-made man or whatever, and the collective desire and repulsion that these images evoke were some of the distortions that Chiron and Aries was working through. Chiron's time in Aries called for a reorganization and negotiation of our ideas around the heroic. Perhaps it requires us to reunite the heroic with its traditional home in the underworld, instead of the desire to defeat death at all costs. To bring the heroic back into balance with the collective psyche, instead of its current location solely in the ego that says it's me against the world, and I'm fighting tooth and nail against the inevitability of death. This obsessive quest for immortality is throwing an already unstable world further out of balance. And, I also love Chiron as the teacher of heroes because he teaches the ego to act right, to not just be solely focused on ourself, our immortality, the defeat of death at all costs, but how to show up for the community, to show up for the world, to show up in all altruistic ways, and to show up to be of service. And so, returning to our tale, Chiron is left wallowing in his cave, tending to his wound. And this is one of the components of Chiron, wallowing, repeating the story of how unfair the wound is, how stupid Hercules shot me with his stupid arrow, and I never asked for this. I was just trying to help, and now I have this dumb wound that will never heal. This is so unfair. And again, the Chiron wound oftentimes is unasked for and is totally unfair and unjust. Yet we have to bear this wound. And the stories that we tell ourselves only serve to increase our suffering. And when Chiron is wallowing in his cave, he loses sight of all of the medicines and wisdom and resources that he has collected. And all he can see is the wound, and the story repeats about how unfair it is. And the work with Chiron, and part of the work with Chiron is our ability to get out of the story and out of the space of suffering so that we can see what resources we have that surround us and are able to support our healing. Because oftentimes the medicine grows next to the poison. And what we need to be able to heal is actually within reach if we gain the perspective and awareness to reach for it, or to ask for help. So Chiron searches far and wide for a cure. But I'm sorry to say that the Chiron wound has no cure. However, we do develop a greater capacity to be with it, to befriend it, and to integrate it. It will still get activated throughout our lives, but we learn to work with it. And the wound points the way to the work that we get to do to support ourselves and to help support others. And one of my favorite astrologers, Carolyn Casey, said this thing one time, which I absolutely love. And she said, I want to do away with the word trauma. She said that I want to replace it with the phrase, my beautiful, dangerous mission. And that's really stuck with me. And I think that's like so spot on. And I think this is such a Chiron idea because the core wound that Chiron shows us is the mission that we are given throughout life. And through going into the wound, we enter into a place where we enter into an initiation through which we are able to transform ourselves. And through that process, we are able to share what we have learned from our own experience in ways that help to support others. And so Chiron searches for a cure, and while nothing fixes this wound, he deepens his skill and his ability as a healer, allowing him to share his wisdom with others and facilitate the healing of other beings. And so our story comes to a resolution with Chiron trading places with Prometheus. Prometheus was a titan and trickster who had the gift of foresight, and he stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans so that humans could reach our full potential. This pissed Zeus right off, so he chained Prometheus to a rock and had his eagle pick out Prometheus's liver forever and ever and ever. But because Prometheus was an immortal, his liver would grow back, and every day the torture would begin again. And so again, we have this, cycle of wounding, but never being released from that suffering. Prometheus was doomed to stay there, chained to this rock, in this unfortunate condition until an immortal would give their life for him and agree to live in Tartarus and trade their destiny with Prometheus, which is insane because no one wants to do that. So again, here we see this a theme of Chiron, the repetition of pattern that keeps us locked in a state of suffering. And with Chiron moving into fixed Taurus, part of the healing process may come from learning to let go. Taurus being fixed Earth can be pretty stubborn and want to hold on to what it perceives to give safety and security. However, familiar and secure are not always the same thing. We may be holding on to things that feel familiar and provide some sense of comfort that also keeps us locked in patterns of suffering. And I think addiction is a great example of that. And the work of Chiron and Taurus is to step outside of these old patterns and to begin to develop new systems that support where we are and who we want to become. And, uh, anyway, Hercules has been feeling pretty bad about wounding his friend with this poison arrow, and yeah, so he begins to broker a deal with his dad Zeus to allow Chiron to take Prometheus's place on the rock. When the deal goes down, Prometheus is freed, and Chiron spends 9 days in Tartarus and is released from life, and Zeus immortalizes him in the constellation of Centaurus. And so here we see the redemption of the heroic. Hercules, who wounds Chiron in a drunken melee when he is only thinking of himself and his own heroic quest, now shifts and begins to turn his attention to supporting others, having the courage to make amends through action. And I think these are honorable qualities of the heroic, when it is not driven by the ego, but uses one's courage and qualities for the benefit of others, to protect and support the vulnerable, and to be of service to the greater collective good. The courage of the hero is also an important quality of the healing process. The willingness to lean into the dark and scary territory within ourselves, and the courage to sit with the discomfort in ourselves and others in order to facilitate a healing process. Chiron is able to hold both courage and compassion in his exchange with Prometheus. The courage and willingness to go into hell, to help another being, and the compassion to truly witness Prometheus and his suffering, and the ability to literally put himself in Prometheus's place. It's interesting to note that Prometheus has been linked to the planet Uranus, and Richard Tarnas has a great essay about how Prometheus should actually, or Uranus should be actually be called Prometheus. And again, Chiron's orbit in the sky takes it between Saturn and Uranus. It forms a bridge. And Chiron's position in the sky is moving into Taurus, which is the sign right between where Saturn lies in Aries and where Uranus just moved into in Gemini. And so Chiron, in the sky, literally between them. And Chiron, again, is seen as the bridge between the traditions of Saturn and the innovations of Uranus. And Melanie Reinhardt says of this relationship, Saturn, the ring planet, represents form and tradition, the structures of society, the urge to conserve and maintain. And Uranus represents the desire to destroy or rebel against structures and the status quo in the name of freedom, progress, and individuality. Chiron represents the eternalized authority that is socially responsible and aware of the limits of human mortality, yet also committed to individual growth and service to others. Chiron in the sky is following Uranus's path through Taurus, perhaps soothing and hopefully integrating some of the material that Uranus stirred up over the past 14 years in Taurus. Things like ecological issues and the acceleration of climate crisis, as well as wealth inequality, economic instability, might be addressed in new ways. And hopefully, some healing can occur in these collective Taurian areas of life. With Chiron and Taurus, we are being called to heal our values and the places where we may have betrayed our core values in order to fit in or to survive. As collective issues become more fraught, we're going to need to consider what we value and what our core values are, and consider ways we can live in alignment with these values and honor what we value instead of, betraying them for a bag full of money or for the promise of security. Because to live out of alignment with our core values creates deep wounding, which is hard to heal until we learn to reconcile our life with our value system. Prometheus fought to uphold his values and his belief in the potential of humanity no matter what the cost. And Melanie Reinhardt's writes, Prometheus epitomized the struggle of individuality emerging from enchainment by the forces of oppression, whether these forces are political or religious. He is a cultural hero, bringing in the new, and Chiron addresses the suffering felt during the change. And then they all lived happily ever after. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that this was helpful for somebody out there. This is maybe like 40% of my thoughts on Chiron, but I wanted to, make it palatable. So yeah, I appreciate y'all being out there. And yeah, I apologize that I'm not getting through all the transits of the week. If I have the time, which is doubtful, maybe I'll make some short videos about the rest of the stuff going on. But I don't know. I love me some Chiron, and I, wanted to honor this shift. And so, yeah, thanks for tuning in. And again, if y'all are interested in your own Chiron placement, hit me up. You can find me on Instagram at Blind Stallion Space Wizard or through my website, Camp Wizard Camp. I'm booking into July, and yeah, we can hook you up with a Chiron reading. All right, my friends. Until next time, when I'll return with my regularly scheduled program, I hope you all have a great week in space. And until next time, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, may the force be with you. All right, bye now.